All right. Okay. Well, our goal tonight will be to continue to move forward in our understanding or discussion of how to study narratives, particularly, of course, biblical narratives. And we talked about last week this fourth step in the process after we've studied the book is where we give specific attention to the story, a particular story that we're studying in the book. And as we look at it, we want to study it as a story. And so there are certain features of narratives that we want to remember and pay particular attention to as we study the story. Again, our goal is to find what is the author's intended meaning, what is his point from that story, how does that story fit within the book, within the purpose of the book and what the author is trying to teach us. And so last week we talked about the four aspects or the four key components of narrative analysis or narratives: or setting, scene, character, and the plot. And if you remember, the setting, the focus there is on the details, the background of the story, where it happened, when it happened. The scenes are the building blocks of a story. They're the separate pieces that make up the particular story that carry the sequence of events. The character analysis is where we look at the main characters in the story and see their role and how they function and how they're used in the story. And then finally, all that leads us to the plot and determining really the sequence of events of the story and how those events connect together to form the point of the story that the author is trying to make. And so in narrative analysis, we dig into each of those four elements or aspects of the story. And by doing all of these particular steps, it helps us to then understand, hopefully, our goal is to understand what the author's trying to say within the story. And as we talked about before, just the importance of this is we want to get to what the author's saying, of course, because stories are narratives are often misinterpreted because we'll see something in the story that speaks to us and then sort of make that the point of the message or the sermon or the teaching. And that may not be what the author's trying to focus attention on. And so narratives, like Dwayne mentioned earlier about baptism, there's often misunderstanding about that. And it's important to understand what baptism is and why, the purpose. In the same way with biblical narratives, we need to understand what it is the author is trying to tell us through the story, not what is some event in the story that I think is interesting, and then I make a whole sermon about that, and that may not be the focus of the author at all. As I mentioned last week, narratives are descriptive, not prescriptive in nature. And so just because something happens in a story doesn't mean, this is what the point of the story is, and I'm going to preach a sermon about this particular event in the story. So we just have to be very careful. So how do we avoid that? Well, it's taking each of these pieces, the setting, the scenes, the characters, the plot, and sort of carefully examining each of those pieces. And then from that, I think we're much better able to identify what the author's trying to tell us in the story. So with that, last time that we gathered, we focused our attention on the setting. So we talked a lot about that. I'll just do a very quick review. And then tonight I'd like us to I'd ask you to read Genesis 22, because I want to use that story as sort of a for us to do an exercise together, go through that story, looking at these different aspects of the setting, the scene, the characters, and the plot. So with the setting analysis, again, the setting is focused on really the when and the where of the story. When did it happen? Where did it happen? And then also the who, and the who is in the sense of the characters in the story, the setting or the place of the story. What is the culture in which that story takes place? What do we know about the people that are a part of that story? And so that's the setting, that's the background of the story. We could think of it as the background context of the story. And so the procedure that we went through last time we were together to do the setting analysis of the story was first reading through the whole story several times, making observations. We've done that for the book where we've read the whole book. Now we want to focus our attention on the particular story. And so again, it's reading is such an important part of Bible study, and reading something through many times to get familiar with it is very important. So the first step then is to do that, read through the story, then make observations from the story, look for specific things. Again, do you see anything repeated? Does anything stick out or seem important? Is there anything in the story that seems confusing or puzzling that you have questions about? Just what do you notice from reading through that story several times? And then the next steps are focusing specific attention on the various parts of the setting. The first one is the where. That is what's the location? Where does the story taking place? Are there any features in the story or physical objects in the story that are a key part of the story? Like if you're talking about, if we're reading the story of Jesus walking on the water, then you would want to mention not only the location, the Sea of Galilee, but obviously there's a boat that's important within that story. So that will be part of the setting, a boat and the sea itself. And then secondly, the temporal or time aspects of the story. That is, when does the story take place? What time period? Do we know a particular time of year that it takes place? Do we know that the time of day that it happens? So for example, when Jesus was walking on the water, that took place at night. So it's the time element of the story. And then finally, we want to look for the cultural element of the story. That is, in what culture does the story take place? Who are the people involved? Are they people of Israel or Judah? In what time period? Or are they, if we're reading John 4, that involves the Samaritans. So what do we know about the Samaritans? What do we know about the Jew and Samaritan relationship? So we want to look for cultural aspects. What do we know about the people groups involved in the story? That can be very important. And then the last part is just sometimes there's other elements of the story and maybe how it fits within the broader narrative that we would want to take note of. So these are the particular steps for understanding the setting of the story, the where, the when, the who, and then just anything else in general regards to that. So are there any questions on this? Because what I want to do is have us take a look at, go into, do an exercise from Genesis 22. But before we do that, I just want to ask any questions. I know not everybody was here last week, so that might be, some of this might be a little bit new to you, but anyone have any questions or comments at this point? I think with setting, it's fairly straightforward. You're just trying to figure out the when and the where and the situation of the story. So That's really all we're looking for when we do that. Now, if there's no questions, I'd like for us to turn our attention to Genesis 22 and just go through that together. I'm going to give you some time on your own to sort of look for the setting within this story, look for those elements that we just talked about, and then we'll come together and discuss that. But before we do that, I'd like us to just read the story together. And then what we'll do is I'll have you take a few minutes on your own and make some observations from the story. And then we'll go through and identify these, the setting of the story. All right. So with that, I think I've got, I've broken up the story. I think we're all familiar with this particular story. That's why I chose it. And it's, but I thought it'd be a helpful one to go through together. So let's see, I've got 4 sections here. Let me start with you, Chai. If you could read this first section, verses 1 to 5, and then Fu Wei, if you could read 6 through 10, Zhao Li 11 to 15, and then Shu Long, if you could read 16 to 19. All right. And then as we're reading, just you know, start trying to identify, you know, make some observations in your mind, and then also see if you can identify the setting of the story as we go through it. But you, Chai, if you could start us off, verses 1 through 5.
Yes, we do.
Thank you.
Genesis 22, verse 1. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And he split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you.
Okay. Verse 6, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, his son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood, and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar. On top of the wood, Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son.
Verse 11 through 15. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withhold your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horn. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "In the mount of the Lord it will be provided." Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven.
16. And said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done these things and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed should possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham lived at Beersheba.
All right, thank you. Okay, so what I'd like to give you guys, I want to give you guys some time to now make some observations from the passage. Let me see, I'm trying to set this up here. Give me a minute to do this. All right. Okay, so let me this. All right, hopefully you guys can see. I've got the text on one side, the whole story, and then just we'll make some observations together. But first, what I'd like to have you do is just on your own now, take a few minutes, read through the story again, and just look. Right now, we just want to make some observations, get familiar with the story. So read through it on your own once or twice, and just look for things. Do you see anything repeated, anything interesting, anything that seems important, any questions? This is just the opportunity to interact with the story and just get to know it better. Again, I know it's a familiar story, but still take some time and just sort of read through it carefully again, and then we'll come back together and see what kind of observations you guys made. Okay, we'll do that first, and then we'll do the rest of the setting analysis. But first, I'd like to just continue to encourage the reading and the observing step in the process. So any questions? So if you've got another translation that you want to use, that's fine. Just can read through that as well. But go ahead and do that, and then maybe take some notes, make some observations. If you could write them down or type them up or something like that, and then we'll come back together. I'll give you about maybe 10 minutes or so just to do this on your own as an exercise, and then we'll come back together. Okay.
All right.
All right. I'm going to pause. Okay, well, let's take a few minutes and discuss some of the things that you noticed or observed from the story. And again, at this step, we're not we have to be careful we don't start getting into too much interpretation of the story. This is just an early step. Certainly we can make suggestions or, you know, present possibilities or things like that, but this isn't the step where we're going to now, you know, preach the sermon from the story right after this. This is the initial step, just getting familiar with it. So with that understanding, let me first, I'll just open it up in general and ask, what are some observations that you guys came up with? Maybe I'll start with you, Tangin. What are some things that stuck out to you that you noticed? And it can be major or minor, doesn't matter, just anything that stuck out. Tangin, any observations from you?
And for me, verse 8 and then verse 14 is obvious.
Sorry, I didn't catch. What about those two verses?
The second one is, verse 8 and 10. And also, verse 1, we see God tested Abraham. Yeah, God. And also, when we come to verse 11, the name of God is changed. I mean, the angel of the Lord, something like that.
Yeah, he comes on the scene in verse 11, the angel of Yahweh. You were mentioning something about verses 8 and 14. What was?
Verse 8 is talking about God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. I mean, God will provide himself. And also verse 14, Abraham named the place as the Lord will provide.
Yes, good. And even how, and then he even repeats, it will be provided. So we see a repetition there as well, don't we? Repetition of the word provide, repetition. All right, good. All right, how about you, Shulong? Any observations, or they could be questions as well, anything that you found from the story?
Okay, let me explain something here. Okay, because my observation is about this where, who, when. Okay, start from who. Okay, I divided into two groups of actually 3 groups. Okay, God. Okay, in general. Okay, from verse 1, and then appear as the angel of the Lord. Okay, in verse 11, this is the first group, and the human. This is they are Abraham, Isaac, and the 2 of his young men. And the third group is the animals, donkey and ram. Okay, this is what I observed about who. And then second is where. Okay, the general sense is the land of Moriah, and the particular place is one of the mountain. Then more particular is the Abraham built the altar, and the climax of the storyline happened Okay, from verse 9 to verse 14 is at the site of this altar. And another place is from heaven. And then it changed because after the first time of the voice from this heaven, so there it happened. The climax happened and changed the name by Abraham. Okay, the praise the Lord will provide. And then after that, that is a place Abraham lived in Beersheba. Okay, this is what I observe over this question of where and when. Okay, now it's about when, because this is now it came verse 1. Now it came about after this thing, so it should be continued from the previous verses. Then we know that what is after these things, but now we move to the particular time. This is earlier in the morning. They start the journey, and on the third day they saw the place from distance. Then after that, Abraham asked the two young men stop somewhere, and they continue the journey. I mean, Abraham and the son walk together together to the particular place and build the altar. And then after that, the time is about the first time the voice came from the heaven. And I noticed that verse 12, that is the time he said, for now I know that you fear God. When it happened, when he tried to slay his son. I mean, Abraham tried to slay his son. And then there's this another time idea from verse 15. Then the angel, okay, of the Lord called to Abraham a second time. So now the focus is moved from the first time to the second time, and say something about the promise. From confirm the faith of Abraham. When the voice from heaven came down to Abraham, now you move the focus to the second time, the voice from heaven, and confirm the promise. So this is what I observe.
Very good.
All right. So you kind of jumped into the next steps there as well, looking for the where and the when. But good, a lot of good detail. Thank you. Bouet, you have anything to add to that? Any observations or even questions maybe that you had as you went through the passage?
Okay, so basically I just focus on 3 words. So the first one will be on the verse 2, offer him, me offer the son of Abraham, it's Isaac. Then the second one will be on the verse, let me see, yeah, verse 9. Basically the whole step, how Abraham is going to do the offering. And the last one will be go straight to the verse 18. The last verse is about the angel said that you have obey my voice. Yeah, these are 3 verses I focus on. Main draw my attention about for this story.
Okay, good. Those stuck out to you as important. Yeah, good. So that was verse 2 and was it, would you say 9 and 18?
Yeah, 9, 18.
All right. Okay, good. Anybody else? You Chai, do you have anything stuck out to you from the story, or just general
Just
observation?
A few things, thanks. One of which I think Shulang has also pointed out in verse 1, after these things, or it came about after these things, the different translation render it to give an idea that it is a reasonable lapse of time from chapter 21. We do not know how long. Of course, I have a side question. Why is that important, the time setting? Because it will give us some clue as to how old probably Isaac was when he was about to be sacrificed. So after some time. The other observations I have is the repetition. One is that in verse 2, when God spoke to Abraham, there is this repetition. I mean, it's funny, right? I mean, Abraham at that point in time had two sons. One he has dispatched off, which is Ishmael, and really his son through faith or miraculous son is Isaac. So it's funny that God should say to Abraham in verse 2, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. I mean, it is not as though Abraham has got, numerous sons and God has to say which one. And that idea of take your son, your only son, Isaac, is repeated in the later half of verse 12, when the angel said, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. That's one observation of repetition. The other repetition was interesting. It seems to give the idea that Abraham was really close to God, because it says in verse 3 about Moriah, and this the phrase is God had told him about. So this phrase God has told him about is in the end of verse 3, and it is also in verse 9. So obviously God has told Abraham the specific place. In this case, Moriah, and the specific, could not be just a place where he should sacrifice Isaac. And the third observation I have is the pronoun we, because it is in verse 2, second half of verse 2, it was clear that God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac there as a burnt offering. All right. So Abraham knew from the word go that he was asked by God to sacrifice Isaac. Right. And you hang on to that thought. And then with the observations of the pronoun we in verse 5, that Abraham, after he has asked the two young men to wait for him and Isaac and him went along, and then he used the pronouns we will worship. This is towards the later part of verse 5. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. So you have to start reading or thinking what was going on in Abraham's mind, because in verse 2, God's specific instruction was for him to sacrifice Isaac. Why is he having that confidence and the assurance that we will worship and we will come back to you?
Yeah, that's good. It's good observation. That Abraham says that either he's lying, or he's confident that it's going to happen, or he's hopeful that it's going to happen.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
Yeah, good. And even too, I think one thing that stuck out to me when he said your son, your only son, Isaac, why the repetition there? And then he had another son though. Isaac wasn't his only son. He had Ishmael. So what is it about Isaac that God would say your only son? Obviously, there's something unique or specific to Isaac that we know, of course, he's the son of promise. But anyway, that stuck out to me as well. and just the questions about why would God refer to him as your only son when Abraham, of course, had another son who wasn't with him, or right, he was gone at that point, but that stuck out. Good observations. Let's see. Anyone else? Daniel, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I'd like to add. I noticed something about Abraham, looking at Abraham. As was pointed out by Yu Chai, I'm not going to repeat what he said in verse 2, but I noticed that Abraham did a lot of seeing. You will notice that throughout the passage, he was seeing at the present moment, as well as seeing afar off. And when God told him to take your son, your only son, he did not look at Ishmael. He saw Isaac, because knowing that that is the son of promise. And then he was told to go to the land of Moriah, to one of the mountains, which I will tell you. And I recall that when Abraham was asked to leave his homeland of Ur, God told him, I'll go to the land, I will show you. So there is sort of that faithful look, in that sense, in Abraham. So there was the seeing by Abraham. And then on the third day, we find again that Abraham raised his eyes, and now he saw the place from a distance. Earlier on, when God told him, you go there. So he was trying to, make out, where is this place, land of Moriah, which mountain. And then on the third day, he raised his eyes, lifted up his eyes. There was the upward look, and he saw the place from a distance. And then, of course, he went up with the sun, and then the wood for the burnt offering, and so on. And of course, he told the young man that they're going there to worship. So there was another look beyond the mere action of what he was going to do. He was going to worship. So he knew that he was going up there to face God, to be in the presence of God, to worship. Okay, and then the other seeing was that when Isaac asked him, where is the lamb for the burnt offering? That is the second part of verse 7. And again, you see Abraham sort of could see with the eye of faith. So God will provide. Okay? And so then they reached the place, of course, and he was about to slay his son, and he was told not to do it. Again, the repeat of your son, your only son. And verse 13 says, again, Abraham looked up. So this is looking upward, the look of faith. He looked up, and there he saw a ram. Went over, took the ram for the burnt offering. So he kept seeing God's plans, God's purpose with the eye of faith, and he was able to fulfill what God wanted him to do, actually. And then towards the latter part of verse 17 and 18, so when the angel told him, said, yes, I know now that you have done this and not beheld your only son. I will bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and so on and so forth, because they have obeyed me. So again, a very far off look, but in faith, knowing that God is going to bless him. So I was taken up by the word see, lifting up his eyes and looked, and so on.
All right, good. Good, thank you.
Okay.
All right, I think everybody, everyone, oh, Dwayne, anything from you? You're the only one I haven't. Any other observations that?
Burnt offering is listed 6 times. And
yes.
6 times, that's significant. And that's 400 years before the law was given. Now, I looked in my concordance, and though that there is a few places where it's called the burnt offering, but it's kind of interesting to see how that 400 years before the law was given and the sacrifices was formulated, 6 times burnt offering is mentioned.
Yeah, let's see, what verses of that? Verse 2 and 3.
3, 6,
6.
7, 8, and 12.
All right, good. Yeah, and that was a thing that popped in my mind as well, the burnt offerings, but yeah, the Mosaic covenant had not been put in place yet. In fact, it would be a long time. So what was the understanding of burnt offerings at this point in time? This is a question that came in my mind, but yeah, good observation. And then, yeah, the term burnt offerings repeated several times throughout the account. Another question popped in my head was, again, why isn't Sarah mentioned in the story? Was she not aware of what was going on, or is it just, I don't know. She came into my mind. It's like, did Moses or Abraham sort of sneak away from it? Didn't tell her what God said? I don't know. We aren't told, so it's just speculation. But it was a question that came into my mind. What did she know about this whole situation? And then Isaac too. What was he thinking as he was put on the altar? Of course, we're not told, so we can't make stuff up, but it's just a question that popped in my head. Because at this point in time, he was not a little baby, right? He was a young man. So,
well, Abraham bound him.
Yeah.
I would suppose that was rather traumatic when he started tying up his son, and so he could lay him on the altar. I don't think that was voluntary. I think Abraham probably had a struggle with him as Isaac began to realize what's going on.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, that would be the natural reaction of anybody, right? Wait a minute. What's going on here? What are you doing? This doesn't make any sense, because it doesn't appear that Abraham, right, hadn't told Isaac the whole situation, right? Because Isaac asked about where's the sacrifice, and he says God will provide it. So apparently Isaac was probably not aware of the situation. So certainly this would have been a shock, and probably, you're right, a struggle for him. Anybody in general have any other final thoughts or questions? I like that when I make observations, I like to ask lots of questions for a couple reasons. One, asking questions sort of gets you thinking about, as you study the pattern, really provides if you're curious, then as you're studying the story, that you're going to want to answer those questions. So that curiosity will help to, I think, motivate in the study. And also too, asking questions is a way to engage the mind and really think about the story actively. So I like to come up with, think about questions that I have as well. And sometimes they may be important or unimportant, or like the question about Sarah. I don't think there's no answer. It would all be just guessing, but it just gets you thinking about other elements of the story. I think questions can be important in the story. Like, for example, a question that popped in my head as well is in verse 12, God says to Abraham, now I know, right? Let's see, how did he put it?
Now I know that you have.
Now I know that you fear God. And so, of course, theologically, we know that God is omniscient. So what did that mean? You know, that's a question that came to my mind. So that's something that as I'm studying the story, I'm thinking about. You know, I don't, and the questions aren't meant to, okay, let me answer them right away, but they are meant to just prompt the curiosity and prompt the motivation of study and really get to think about the story. Because a lot of times when we make observations, we make conclusions or just state things, you know, and that's fine. But also with observations, you want to be asking questions of the text. You want to be thinking about, you know, why did God provide a ram instead of a lamb, for example? Is that significant? Does that matter? It may or may not. At this point, you know, I don't know, but I'm asking the questions to get me engaged in the passage and to be thinking about it in more detail. So make sure when you make observations, also include a lot of questions as well. I think that's a helpful way to be active in making your observations. All right. Any other comments or questions about that?
I have a question, just a curious question, which I didn't see before. In verse, where is it now? Verse 6? Yeah, verse 6, where Abraham took in his hand the fire and the knife. The knife, I can understand. You need a knife for sacrifice. I also can understand you need a fire to do burnt offering. But what my question is, wouldn't it at that time, I mean, by that time, people know how to start a fire and you don't need to physically carry a torch all the way, unless it was at night.
So the carrying the fire, the torch.
Yeah.
What was the question? What was your
question? Why would Abraham needs to carry the fire? I mean, wouldn't it at that time they know how to set a fire?
Oh, I see.
Or they may have a fire, you know, the stones and whatever it is, all right? I mean, why did he have to carry the fire?
Yeah. And so why would he need to carry the fire? All right. Another thing I'm sorry, go ahead.
This week I was listening to some audio books by Murray. Was it George? John? I forget. Anyway, Andrew Murray.
Yes.
Anyway, I find him very interesting. He's quite a theologian and challenged me a few times. But he used this story when it says that take Isaac, your only son that you love, and this was Andrew Murray took that and made a test of whether this boy, Isaac, was getting more important than his God, and made that application. Was he really loving God first, like we're required, and not making an idol out of his son? I was challenged by that because there's stuff that gets in the way, and we need to be careful about that. And so, was that the test? Well, it almost looks that way. Anyway, that was his particular take on it. I was encouraged by that. That spoke to my heart. What do we love first? Do we have idols in our life? there's no room for anything but the Lord Jesus in the Christian's heart. And that, of course, is evident. And it goes all the way back to Isaac, Abraham.
Yes, certainly.
As a little boy.
Certainly our experience as parents, right? Those of us that have children, understand that can be a challenge, to love your kids more than the Lord, or to make an idol out of them. So certainly that, we aren't told explicitly in the text that was going on with Abraham, but I think certainly it would not be it could be a very, very strong possibility. I think too, we got to look at the story, and we will as we progress in the story, how the story fits in the bigger picture of this part of the book of Genesis and the Pentateuch, because there are some connections to some much broader themes as we go forward. But yeah, all of these are good. These are the kinds of things we want to look for, and as we do this step and making observations, is just really spend time thinking about the passage, noticing things that seem to be repeated or connections, asking questions. And again, there's no right, wrong answers here at this point. We're not making conclusions of anything at this point. We're just trying to notice things. That's the main idea. I'd like to have you take a few more minutes. Shu Long already did most of this, so he probably won't need to take much time. But for the rest of us, just what I'd like us to do is take a few minutes and fill in these 4 elements here. Go back through the story and identify each of these aspects of the setting. Now that we're a little more familiar with the story, go back and see if you can identify where the story takes place, when, identify maybe any cultural features that would be important to understand, and then if anything else sticks out. So Shulong already mentioned several things to help us on this, but go ahead and take a few minutes now to do that. We'll come back together and finish this element of the setting analysis, okay? So make sure as well as you go through the story, just note what verse or verses you identify where you find the information, okay? Actually, let me do this. There we go. All right. So I'll give you guys a few minutes and we'll come back together. So look for these 4 elements: the where, the when, the culture, and anything else. All right. Okay. Well, hopefully this shouldn't take too long since we already talked a little bit about this before. But let's start then with the physical aspects of the story. That is the location primarily. Anybody want to answer this one first? Where does the story take place?
The land of Moriah.
Okay. And then we want to note any verse, what the verses where we find that.
Verse 2.
Okay, verse 2.
And then it's one of the mountains.
Yeah, at a particular mountain. Okay, now does the whole story take place in the land of Moriah?
Or they have to journey, and it says 3 days. 3 days will be probably about 60 miles. So probably they were traveling from Beersheba to Moriah.
Yeah, we actually, if we go back,
yes.
Well, there's two places, right? As Shulong mentioned earlier, Abraham returned and they went to Beersheba. So that's where they started, actually. And we see that in verse 19, but then also in verse 33 and 34.
Yep, chapter 21.
Abraham sojourned in Beersheba. So the story begins. Let's see, and then the story begins in Beersheba, right? That is where God speaks to Abraham, and then that's where they return to at the end of the story. Okay. Now, any other physical aspects to the story that are here? Someone already mentioned I think it was Shulong mentioned, right? There's a donkey in the story. Of course, we have the wood, the knife, fire, have to do with the altar. And then, of course, the very important part of the story, especially from Isaac's perspective, is the ram. So you might want to mention some of those. Altar, perhaps. What's most significant, though, is the location. So it's a journey from Beersheba to Moriah at a particular mountain. And if you want at this point to look at maybe a resource, a map or something, does anybody know where is Beersheba? Maybe in reference to Jerusalem. We don't have a Jerusalem yet at this point in history, but we do know where Jerusalem is located. Does anybody know where Beersheba is?
It will be southwest from Jerusalem.
Yeah, anybody know the distance? Roughly?
It's about 3 days journey, about 60 miles.
So you mentioned 60 miles. So maybe, 100 kilometers-ish.
Yeah.
Around. 100 kilometers from Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's interesting if you say, if you take 100 kilometers, an average man walking a day is probably about 30-ish kilometers.
Yeah.
So that makes some logical sense.
Yeah, seems reasonable. Of course, they had camels, so maybe it was 80 or 90 kilometers, but it'd be in that, somewhere around that range.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think they estimated, somewhere around 90 kilometers as the bird flies.
Yeah.
All right, good. One other thing.
About 75 miles, I think. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm saying it in imperial measures. 75 miles. That would be. Because I have a map here and it's given in miles, so I'm just trying to convert it. 75 miles times 0.6 is about 50 kilometers. No.
Yeah, that
100 kilometers. Yeah, 100 odd kilometers. 115 kilometers or something.
Okay, so there's that.
Yeah.
You can consult a resource for that. That's good. But better, again, want to find as much information as we can on our own. And then, like what I did was after I realized it's Beersheba, I just went and looked at a Bible encyclopedia. So, okay, where's Beersheba again? So yeah, it was about this distance southwest of Jerusalem. Also, too, another feature, I did a cross-reference of Moriah, and it took me to 2 Chronicles 3.
Yep.
Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David at that place. So here we learn a very interesting fact later, that actually Mount Moriah, where Abraham offered Isaac, was the same place that David had purchased the threshing floor of Ornan. If you remember, that was when David had counted the people, and God had brought consequences for that. And the angel of the Lord came, or an angel came and was brought consequences upon the people of Judah. And then Israel and David asked him to stop, and he stopped at this threshing floor. Well, that threshing floor became the Temple Mount.
Yeah.
That we learn later on. So anyway, that's an interesting point of connection. So 2 Chronicles 3:1 indicates that Mount Moriah later became Temple Mount. So guess what? Guess where Abraham journeyed to?
Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Jerusalem.
So Abraham journeyed to what would later be
Jerusalem.
Isn't that interesting? So something to keep in mind in the broader story of Scripture. Okay, good. Anything else as far as physical aspects?
Yeah, the verse 18 quotes the seed that Paul is so excited about in Galatians 3:16, the seed, the one, not seeds, but the seed here as a messianic prophecy here, as the covenant is very definitely featured and set forward here. And that verse 18, that seed, it says there, and your seed, all the nations the earth shall be blessed. And Paul identifies that as the prophecy of Christ through Abraham, but he saw his day and identified it. So here it's confirmed again. that seed, not the seeds of the nation, but that one seed, that blessing to the whole earth. And, wow.
Yeah, and even in Hebrews 11, right, mentions this story, of course, later, right, that by faith Abraham offered up Isaac. So we're given some comments about this story later on. Okay, so yeah, those are things that we want to keep in mind for later reference after we've studied the story. But yeah, those are some passages which give connection to this account. All right, good. Let's for the sake of time, let's talk about time, the temporal or time elements of this story. When did this story take place? So what do we know about that? Shulong, you had identified this a little earlier. Do you want to make comment here? When does this story take place?
Oh, you mean that the start of the journey or the climax take place?
Well, we have a few elements. One time element is we want to try to understand, okay, in the historical context, when does this story happen? Is this early in Abraham's life, later in his life? Do we have a specific point in time?
It must be in the late of the Abraham's lifetime, because when this is after he got the real son. I mean, after the born of this Isaac.
Yeah, because Genesis 21:5 tells us Abraham was 100 years old. So by this point, he's over 100 years old, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Notice
in the chapter before, the story of Hagar in the wilderness, and when she lays Ishmael down and prepares to let him die, that's in the chapter before. So it was after Hagar was sent out.
Yes, good. So this Genesis 21, which is where we learn, Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And then, of course, we have the account of Hagar leaving with Ishmael. All right, so at this point in time, when we get to 22, they are gone. And it says that Abraham sojourned in this land in Beersheba for many days. That typically means on the order of years. All right, so Genesis 21:34, many days, could be years. Could be months, but also could be years. And then somebody, I think a couple of you made the comment, came about after these things. So at some point in time, after the events of chapter 21, some time has passed.
At the end of the chapter, Abraham is fathering children yet from a concubine. So he's pretty good shape at 100 years old.
Super
yeah,
he is. He was. He could walk for 3 days, and he hiked up to the mountain.
The mountain.
Yeah. So yeah, he's doing pretty good for 110 or whatever he was at this point. All right. So yeah, so this is sometime later in Abraham's life. He's well over 100 years old. He's been in the land of Beersheba for a period of time, living there, and then comes this story. And then, as was mentioned, the story takes place over how long a period of time?
was at least 3 days.
Yeah, and if we include the first day, it's a course of basically 4 days, right? Abraham's given the instruction, then the next day he leaves, and it's a 3-day journey to Mount Moriah. So it takes place over the course of 4 days. All right. So that's what we're looking for when we're talking about the time frame. All right. There's a general sense. Sorry, yeah. Somebody have a comment?
Yeah. I'm just wondering. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I noticed something about time. If you look at verse 3, it says, "So Abraham rose early in the morning." Because the NIV version says early the next morning. In the King James, Abraham rose up early in the morning. I sense that when God told Abraham, "You go to this place, and I'm going to ask you to do this, to offer this burnt offering." Abraham didn't dilly-dally. He rose up early in the morning. I think that tells a lot. The Lord. I'm trying to read it, and the Lord tells us, to do something. There's no procrastination and dilly-dallying and pussyfooting and so on. He rose up early in the morning. There was a purposefulness in what he wanted to do. And so he rose up early in the morning and went there. So that is another time aspect I was thinking of.
Okay, good. Yeah, he got up early either because he was obeying quickly or because he didn't want Sarah to wake up. So, like, what are you doing?
I'm going to kill your son.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, no, he didn't know about that.
But yeah, in the context of the story, it seems that probably his main motivation was out of faithful obedience. But I just thought about that. I wonder if it didn't hurt that he left early, and maybe Sarah didn't have to know what was happening. But okay, good. Now, as far as cultural aspects, for this, it would be, Israel was not yet a nation. So we're in the time of Abraham lived in the days that are known, the days of the patriarchs, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this is, well before Israel had become a nation. Okay. This is well before the Mosaic covenant, well before the law was given. So this was a much earlier point in time. What was, I think, 400 years or so that somebody mentioned before the law? Dwayne, was that you that said that? Let's see. Because yeah, it would be some point in time before Moses came on the scene.
430 years.
430, that's right. What passage was that mentions that? I can't remember off the top of my head.
Oh, I don't know. I'd have to look that up.
Maybe
Yeah.
Galatians.
Galatians mentioned that?
Yeah, I think so.
I thought there was a reference to
I think it's when the children of Israel start their journey. I think it's mentioned. It's in Exodus somewhere.
430 years. You can find it in Genesis 15. 15:15. It's just the end of the chapter. That will be
Genesis 50. Sorry.
Yeah, 15:15. Where is the 400 years? Yeah, verse 13, 15, 13. Is that the one looking at? 15, 1-5, sorry.
Oh, 1-5.
Yeah, Genesis 15, verse 13.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, and this was early on, this Genesis 15. So we're looking at
the 430 years is in Exodus.
Yeah, there we go. Exodus 30.
Yeah. There's a very interesting read up, if you want to, why is 400 in Genesis and 430 in Exodus. That is another story.
Well, of course, Abraham, when he was told that in Genesis 15, he was at the younger point in time. So in any case, yeah, we're given so this is well before the time of the Exodus.
Yep.
So we're in a very, different culture. So that's something to keep in mind. You'd want to understand. And even too, we talked about, what would have been the understanding of burnt offerings at this point in time. We have to be careful we don't presume that it would be the same as when the law was given. That's a cultural aspect we would want to try to understand.
I think Noah offered a burnt offering.
Yes. Yeah, it's mentioned in a few places. Of course, right? You have Cain and Abel. Abel offered burnt offering, and then there's Noah.
Actually, there is no mention of fire or an altar or anything. They just brought their offerings.
Yeah. So we want to kind of, you want to understand, is there anything we can learn from Scripture about the understanding of a burnt offering at this time? Now, by Moses using that term, too, we have to remember, who the author is. It's Moses. Who is the original audience of this? Of course, it's the people of Israel in the time of the Exodus. And so perhaps Moses just uses that term as well with the same understanding that they would have of it, all right? Because he doesn't offer any explanation. He just says that Abraham, right, was going to offer him there as a burnt offering. So perhaps, the people, Moses would have just mentioned that, and the people would have understood that idea in their present context. So, but that's just all we're doing here is, you just want to point out things, cultural elements that would be helpful to try to understand. And certainly, as Dwayne mentioned earlier, because of the repetition of the word burnt offering, and because that is a key part of the story, certainly we'd want to try to understand, well, what would Abraham have thought, burnt offering to be, and what's the significance of it at this point in time? All right. And then finally, other aspects of the story, really just sort of more of, okay, where does this story fit? We have it, what takes place before, right? In the larger context of the book of Genesis, right? We have the Abrahamic covenant, which, by the way, we didn't comment on this, but notice, Dwayne, you alluded to this, but notice at the end of this, the final statement by the Lord is a reference to the Abrahamic covenant.
Yep.
All right. So there's a link to that covenant. That's very significant for understanding what's going on in the story. So that's sort of the broader context. We have the Abrahamic covenant. And then, of course, we had Genesis 19, right? That's Sodom and Gomorrah. And the the angel of Yahweh, right, visits Abraham. Of course, as was mentioned, Genesis 21, we have Hagar and Ishmael leave. Okay, and then of course we have the birth of Isaac as well in that chapter. And then Genesis 23, which comes after 22, we have the death of Sarah.
Yep.
And then in Genesis 24 is
Death of Abraham.
Isaac's bride is found.
Yeah.
Okay, so just trying to place the story in the broader context here of both the book and what comes before and after. All right, but the key part of this with the setting is understanding the where and the when, and then recognizing some of the cultural elements that would be helpful for the story. Okay? All right. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's interesting, Pastor Tim, that you brought up chapter 23, because from there we know that Sarah died at the age of 127. And when Isaac was born, she was 90. So which means the incident in Genesis 22 will be in between these 37 years. And the fact that Isaac was weaned at the age probably about 2 to 5 years old in chapter 21, verse 8. So if you just do a bit of math, Isaac will be anything from about 4 or 5 years old to about 37 when he was sacrificed. So you kind of take your guess. I mean, the scripture doesn't say exactly how old, but it gives you some idea.
Okay, good. Yeah, and it's likely he was probably a young boy at this point in time, because of course, Abraham refers to him as such, as a lad.
Mm-hmm.
So good observation. All right. So that's the setting analysis, just getting familiar with the setting, the background of the story, and the key elements of that. Next time we get together, we'll do what we call the scene analysis of the account and just sort of break down the story into its various scenes. And so we'll talk about that next time we gather. And the focus in narrative analysis is really looking at the narrative, looking at different aspects of it, because as we do that, as we examine it from each different perspective, as we look at the characters, as we look at the setting, as we look at the scenes, and then, of course, the plot, as we consider it from those different angles, those different perspectives, that helps, it gives us insight and understanding of the story. So it forces us to think about the story and look at it from different vantage points, looking for different things. So good. Hopefully that's helpful. So, when we study a story, this is the approach you want to take. First thing we want to do after we understand the book is read the story several times, get familiar with it, make observations, and then get an idea of the setting. All right. Do I know when the story took place, where, those kinds of things. Okay. Any final comments or questions before we finish for the evening? I really like studying stories. I think it's fascinating. There's so many elements, even as we're talking today, some of the things you guys have mentioned, a couple things hadn't occurred to me before in looking at this story. So There's always so much that we can get from the stories in Scripture. So, okay. Well, I'm going to ask then Pastor Dwayne if you could close our time together in prayer.
Father, thank you for a lovely evening and real challenges and real truth. And we see realities that real people in real time, in real places, we are walking in the shadow of. They were faithful. They loved you supremely. And yeah, Lord, you have preserved us in these desperate days, these very frightening days that we're in. Lord, your promises don't fail. And as you took care of Abraham and little Isaac, you take care of the rest of your children. We rest in that, rejoice in it, because of the love and the greatness and the faithfulness of our great Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
All right. Amen. Thank you.
Amen.
All right.
Thank you.
God bless you, brothers. Have a great week. Look forward to seeing you next time.
God bless. Thank you very much.
God bless. Good night. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right.
See you next week. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost 11 o'clock. Man, alive. Anyway.
Good night. All right. Take care. Bye-bye. See you, Zali. Good way. Good night.